They called me irrelevant, but tonight, I'll remind them who built the empire they're standing in. The night sky over Port Briar Bay shimmered with silver light, but inside Hawthorne Manor, the air was heavy with perfume, pride, and whispers. Laughter spilled through the marble hallways like champagne, bubbling and hollow. Beneath the chandeliers, the Graves family celebrated 35 years of marriage, wealth, and illusion. To everyone else, it looked like perfection. To Eleanor Graves, it felt like a performance she was no longer invited to join. She sat near the edge of the ballroom, where the music was faint and the lights dimmed. Her dress, navy silk, chosen by someone else, reflected the glitter of strangers' jewelry. Around her, people smiled too widely and clinked glasses too loudly. Her children moved through the crowd as though she were invisible. Lucas leaned in, his voice low but sharp. "Mom, just sit still. Don't start any stories tonight." His wife Mara adjusted her sequined dress and smirked. "This is a modern event, Eleanor. People don't care about your old traditions anymore." And from across the table, her daughter Clara barely looked up from her phone. "Mom doesn't get what I do anyway. It's fine." Their words cut like thin paper, soft but slicing deep. Eleanor smiled faintly, pretending she didn't hear. She had learned long ago that silence was armor. Yet deep inside she felt it. The loneliness of being erased in her own house. She glanced around the room, the portraits of ancestors she had paid to restore, the grand piano she had chosen decades ago, the chandeliers she had polished before the first mortgage was ever cleared. This home, this wealth, this family, she had built the bones of it. But somewhere along the years they had convinced her she was only decoration. Then came the voice that had once meant comfort. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard Graves called, stepping to the podium. His smile was the kind that had fooled everyone for years, warm, practiced, empty. 35 years. A lifetime of partnership, perseverance, and progress. The crowd applauded, the sound echoing like a hollow drum. Eleanor's eyes followed him. His tuxedo fit too perfectly. His confidence felt rehearsed. A server rolled a silver tray onto the stage. On it sat a velvet box. A murmur spread through the room. "Oh, a gift," someone whispered. How romantic, but Eleanor's chest tightened. She had seen that look in Richard's eyes before, the one that came before destruction, the one he wore before every betrayal disguised as logic. He lifted the box slowly. "Eleanor," he said, voice steady. "After all these years, I thought it fitting to offer something meaningful." She felt her pulse rise. Something was wrong. Something deep. Richard opened the box. No jewelry, no note. Just papers, white, crisp, official. The room stilled. Then gasps rippled like waves breaking on stone. Inside were legal documents. Deed transfers, separation papers, a formal notice written with surgical cruelty. He looked at her and said it as if reading a menu. "It's time for both of us to move on. The estate will be handled fairly." The room went silent. Forks froze midair. Someone whispered, "Is this part of the speech?" Eleanor's throat tightened. "You're divorcing me, here? In front of everyone?" Richard smiled without warmth. "Transparency, my dear. People appreciate honesty." She stared at him. For a moment, she felt the years collapse. The decades of compromise, of quiet endurance, of swallowing words sharper than knives. Around her, people murmured, eager for scandal. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. Mara's eyes darted to the guests. Clara looked like she might faint. Eleanor rose, slowly, gracefully, like someone climbing out of her own grave. She walked to the microphone. The music stopped, replaced by the sound of her heels on marble. She took the mic from Richard's trembling hand and faced the crowd. "If you believe truth deserves light," she said softly, "then listen closely. Some celebrations reveal more than they conceal." The laughter died completely. The crowd leaned forward. Richard's smile faltered. "Eleanor," she raised a hand to silence him. "I've spent 35 years keeping this house upright," she said. "I've sold heirlooms to cover debts. I've kept secrets to protect reputations. But tonight I won't protect anymore." She opened the folder she carried, cream-colored, worn at the edges. Inside were old land deeds, renovation receipts, and letters. This land, Hawthorne Manor, was my inheritance. Every brick restored here was paid with my savings. Every loan repaid was drawn from accounts in my name. Richard chuckled nervously. "You never worked a day in your life." Eleanor turned to him, her voice calm but edged with iron. "I worked quietly so you could speak loudly." Gasps. The audience shifted, whispers darting like lightning through the hall. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She pressed a small button on a remote she had kept hidden in her hand. Behind Richard, the projector flickered to life. A video appeared, grainy, time-stamped secret Richard in his study, voice hushed but clear. If she finds out about the forged deeds, we lose everything. She'll never understand what I've done. The crowd erupted. Someone dropped a glass. Lucas stood frozen. Mara grabbed his arm. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Richard spun toward the screen, face pale. "Turn that off," he shouted. Eleanor didn't move. She simply said, "This isn't an ending, Richard. It's a reckoning." Then she set the microphone down, gathered her folder, and walked off the stage. The papers in the box fluttered to the floor like white ashes, the crowd parting before her as if afraid to touch truth made flesh. As she crossed the hall, she could hear Richard's voice behind her, angry, desperate, cracking. "Eleanor, this isn't over." She didn't look back. She walked through the tall glass doors into the coastal night. The air outside was sharp with salt and cold wind. For the first time in years, her spine straightened. Her breath deepened. She looked at the reflection of the manor lights on the bay, flickering like dying stars. "They thought I was silent," she whispered to herself. They mistook silence for surrender. Her heels clicked down the stone path toward the garden. The night breeze tugged at her shawl. Inside, chaos churned, voices, questions, panic. But outside, only calm. In that stillness, she smiled. The reckoning had only just begun. They say silence is weakness. But silence, when chosen, is strategy. The morning after the party, Hawthorne Manor was quiet. Too quiet. The laughter, the gasps, the whispers had all dissolved into fog that clung to the coastline. Inside, Eleanor Graves sat by her bedroom window, the scent of salt and roses mixing in the air. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, older now, but sharper. She wasn't mourning. She was remembering. Her mind wandered back to the years when everything began to crack, years that the family had conveniently forgotten. There was a time when Richard's voice trembled with fear instead of arrogance. His business, Graves Development, was collapsing under debt. Contractors demanded payment. Clients threatened lawsuits. The phone never stopped ringing. That night, Eleanor had taken a small velvet box from her dresser drawer, the one holding her mother's silver locket. Inside, it was a faded photo of her parents, smiling, their faces full of warmth she hadn't felt in years. She kissed it once before selling it. The jeweler counted the bills without meeting her eyes. That money saved Richard's company from ruin. He had thanked her then, softly, briefly. By morning, he acted as if the sacrifice had never happened. When Lucas got accepted into university, the business was again on the brink. The tuition notice arrived, and Richard said, "We can't afford this right now." But Eleanor couldn't bear the thought of her son giving up his dream. So, she dipped into her own savings, the one her father had left her for emergencies. She signed the check with a shaking hand and told Lucas it was from both of them. He had hugged her that day. But years later, when the money became invisible, so did she. Then came Clara's illness. 10 years old, skin pale, hospital machines blinking like silent witnesses. Richard was too busy negotiating a land deal to stay at her bedside. So Eleanor sold the last of her private investments, covering medical bills without complaint. She told no one. The gratitude she expected never came. Instead, Richard told her she was too emotional with money. Sacrifice became her habit. Love, her currency. And invisibility, her cost. The first betrayal wasn't loud. It was a signature forged neatly on paper. Eleanor discovered it one afternoon while organizing receipts. Her name appeared beside Richard's on a loan document she'd never seen before. When she confronted him, he smiled as if she were a child who'd misplaced her glasses. "It's just for the bank's convenience," he said. "You know how they are about spousal consent." She believed him the first time. The second time she didn't, but it was already too late. Soon, her access to accounts was restricted for safety. Her credit cards were paused for review. Her spending money came through Lucas, who had taken over bookkeeping to help Dad. When she questioned it, Lucas sighed. "Mom, you've been forgetting a lot lately. Let us handle this." The lie of forgetfulness spread quietly. Richard repeated it at dinner parties in soft tones of concern. "She's not herself these days," he'd say. Guests would nod, pitying, never asking her directly. The world believed the narrative he wrote for her. One evening, Eleanor tried to buy groceries and her card was declined. She stood there at the counter, humiliated. The cashier looked at her kindly, but pity burned worse than anger. When she got home, Richard said, "You don't need to worry about small things anymore." He meant it as control, not comfort. Hawthorne Manor had once been her pride, a house she had decorated, tended, and loved. But slowly, room by room, it became a cage. First, they moved her to the smaller guest bedroom at the far end of the second floor. "It's quieter there," Richard said. In truth, it was isolation disguised as kindness. Her journals disappeared next. When she asked about them, Clara said, "We're just organizing things, Mom. Don't make a fuss." Her old letters, photographs, even her sewing box, gone. The walls of her new room were bare except for one small painting she'd done years ago, its colors fading like her place in the family. During family gatherings, she'd sit at the dining table's edge. Guests toasted to progress, never turning to her for stories. Sometimes she'd notice her own portraits replaced with new photographs, frames filled with everyone except her. In one, her face was literally cropped out, replaced with a vase of flowers. That, she thought bitterly, is what they wanted her to be. Decoration. At night, she heard laughter drift down the hall. The kind of laughter that used to fill her kitchen when her children were small. Now it sounded foreign, like it belonged to someone else's family. She would close her door softly and whisper, "I'm still here," just to hear her own voice. If they thought she was too old to notice, they were wrong. If they thought she couldn't understand, they had underestimated her for the last time. Eleanor began watching. From the shadows of hallways, she saw Richard hold hushed meetings in his office. Papers exchanged. Voices low. Once she heard her own name. "Transfer everything quietly," Richard told a consultant. She won't notice. But she did. She noticed the missing keys. The rewritten ledgers. The checks that vanished before she signed them. She memorized every number she saw, every signature she didn't make. At first, it was fear that kept her awake. Then it was focus. She found an old camera and began recording. She hid duplicate documents in envelopes marked with simple letters, A, B, C. She stored them behind the loose brick in the fireplace, the one no one else knew about. Her handwriting filled notebooks, calm and neat. Dates, amounts, lies. When she passed Richard in the hall, she smiled sweetly. When Lucas asked about dinner plans, she nodded politely. When Mara bragged about the estate's modern management, she only said, "Yes, I'm sure it's well handled." But under her breath, she whispered to herself, "Patience is power." She practiced stillness the way others practiced deceit. One winter evening, after dinner, the family gathered in the main living room. Richard talked about new partnerships, Lucas about profits, Mara about social media campaigns. Clara scrolled on her phone. Eleanor sat quietly, unseen. When she spoke once, just once, to mention her opinion about an investment, Richard waved his hand. "Eleanor, let's not complicate things." The others laughed lightly. Not cruelly, but dismissively. Something in her snapped. Not in rage, but in realization. She rose, excused herself, and walked to the mirror in the hallway. Her reflection stared back. A woman who had traded her voice for peace, her power for harmony. She barely recognized herself. Behind her, she could still hear their laughter. "The next time I enter a room," she whispered to her reflection, "they will see me." The house seemed to listen. The wind outside brushed against the windows like agreement. And in that moment, Eleanor Graves stopped being the ghost of Hawthorne Manor. She became the storm waiting to arrive. They called me unstable. But instability built on truth is stronger than composure built on lies. The air in the ballroom still carried the shock of Eleanor's first revelation. The chandelier lights flickered against pale faces. Guests stood frozen, clutching their glasses as whispers spread like wildfire. The music had long stopped. Only the sound of Richard's shallow breathing filled the silence. Richard stepped forward, his composure cracking. "She's not well," he said to the crowd, voice trembling but desperate to sound controlled. "Please, everyone, she's confused, unstable." "You've all seen the signs." Eleanor didn't move at first. Her posture was still, her eyes calm. She simply raised her hand, steady as stone. "Unstable?" she repeated softly. Then let me show you what instability looks like when it finds proof. The murmurs died instantly. The crowd's attention locked on her. Even the sea breeze outside seemed to pause. Richard swallowed hard. Eleanor, this is not the time. Oh, it's exactly the time, she interrupted. Her voice was low, measured, dangerous. You chose tonight to strip me of my dignity in front of strangers. Now I'll return the favor with evidence. She turned to the screen behind him and pressed the remote again. A new document appeared. This time, not a video, but a scanned medical report. The title in bold letters glowed across the projector, DNA test results. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's eyes were steady as she spoke. For 35 years, Richard Graves pretended to be the father of both our children, but only one of those things is true. She paused, letting the tension thicken. Clara is my daughter, but not his. Richard's face drained of color. Eleanor, he hissed, don't you dare. You hid your infertility for decades, she said, her tone cutting through the room like glass. You lied to me, to the world, and to her. Eleanor turned her gaze to Clara, whose trembling hands clutched her champagne flute. When you found out, you falsified documents. You made me believe that I had imagined things, that my memory was weak, my mind unreliable. Gasps echoed. Some guests turned toward the door as if unsure whether to leave or witness history. Mara's lips parted in disbelief. Lucas's jaw tightened, eyes darting between his parents. Clara looked stricken, pale, her eyes wet but confused. Richard tried to laugh, a dry, nervous sound. This is outrageous. She's making this up. Look at her. She's vindictive. She's senile. Eleanor ignored him. She stepped closer to the mic. You built this house on deceit, Richard. But I built a foundation stronger than your lies. She pressed the next button on the remote. The screen flickered again. Another video. Richard sat in his office, talking in low tones to his lawyer. Once we finalize the transfers, Eleanor's name will be erased from everything. She won't even know until the ink dries. The sooner she's gone, the better, the lawyer asked. And if she resists? Richard laughed on screen. Then we'll make her look unstable. She's old. No one will believe her. A stunned silence followed. The sound of that laughter, his laughter, hung in the air like a haunting. Guests looked away, ashamed to be witnesses. Eleanor's eyes swept the room. Do you still believe I am unstable? She asked quietly. Someone clapped. Just once, hesitant but real. Then another joined. The sound grew. The applause spread like a wave of courage through the room, rising above Richard's fury. Turn that off. Richard shouted, lunging for the remote. But before he could reach her, Lucas stepped between them. Dad, he said sharply. Stop. Richard froze. Lucas's voice trembled but was firm. I've seen enough. Mara covered her mouth. Clara's tears finally spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, Mom. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Eleanor's voice softened. Because I wanted to protect you, from him, from this. But protection and silence aren't the same. Tonight you deserve the truth. She turned to the guests once more. Each of you has a small envelope at your table, she said. Inside is a USB drive. Everything on it is real. The forged contracts. The hidden accounts. The transfer papers with my name faked in ink. You've all seen Richard's empire. Now you'll see whose hands actually built it. Guests scrambled to their tables, pulling out the small white envelopes placed discreetly earlier that evening. As screens lit up and documents opened, gasps filled the room again. The sound of betrayal was not a scream. It was the clicking of dozens of phones capturing proof. Richard stood motionless. His mask of power, once unshakable, cracked before everyone's eyes. You planned this, he muttered. You planned this for years, Eleanor didn't deny it. No, she said calmly. I prepared for it. There's a difference. He staggered back, gripping the edge of a table for balance. The guests whispered his name like a curse. His empire of image had just collapsed in real time. Eleanor stepped closer, voice low enough that only he could hear. You built walls to bury me, Richard. But I built doors, and tonight I opened them. Then, without another glance, she turned from him. Her steps echoed against the marble, slow, steady, final. Behind her, chaos erupted. Some guests shouted. Others comforted Clara. Lucas stood still, hands shaking. Richard sank into a chair, face blank, eyes hollow. The mighty patriarch reduced to silence. Eleanor didn't look back. She walked out of the ballroom, her heels tapping against the stone floor like punctuation marks to every lie she'd endured. Outside, the night air greeted her again, sharp and cleansing. The waves from Port Briar Bay crashed softly against the shore. She stopped on the terrace, looking out toward the dark water. The reflection of the manor shimmered on the bay, broken by ripples. For the first time, she saw it not as her prison, but as evidence, a monument to what she had survived. Inside, she could still hear the uproar, the unraveling of a man who had underestimated her patience. Eleanor's hand brushed against her collarbone, where the silver locket once hung. "You thought I'd stay silent," she whispered, her voice steady against the wind. "You forgot. I remember everything." She turned from the house, her shadow stretching long across the terrace stones, and disappeared into the night. The reckoning had become revelation. They buried my truth in dust. They forgot that dust remembers. The night after the chaos, Hawthorne Manor stood in silence. Reporters had gathered briefly outside the gates, flashes of light cutting through the fog. By morning, the cameras were gone, but whispers still lingered inside the walls. Eleanor waited until the house slept. She moved quietly through the corridor, the sound of her slippers barely touching the floor. The portraits along the hallway stared at her, faces of ancestors painted in oil, judging or approving, she couldn't tell. She reached the end of the hall where a single door stood behind layers of cobwebs and dust. It had been sealed for years, her old art conservatory, the place where her hands once created beauty before life demanded sacrifice. With a firm twist of an old brass key, the lock gave way. The door groaned open, and a stale breath of time drifted out. The conservatory was a museum of ghosts. Dust coated everything. The easels, the canvas frames, the half-finished painting of the sea. Moonlight streamed through cracked glass panes, illuminating boxes stacked in the corner, each labeled in her handwriting from years ago. Restoration receipts, estate files, personal letters. She coughed softly and moved toward the boxes, her heart pounding not from fear, but from certainty. She knew what lay buried here. Inside the first box, she found stacks of old contracts and bank ledgers, some with her signature, others crudely forged. Her name appeared on loans she never approved, debts she never owed. The next box held letters between Richard and his financial advisor, discussing asset reallocation and document modification, a polite way to describe theft. Then she found the file marked medical. Her hands trembled as she opened it. There, among test results and physician notes, were records of Richard's long-hidden infertility treatments. The dates matched the early years of their marriage, the years when she blamed herself for their struggles. He had known the truth all along. Her eyes stung, but no tears fell. "So this is where you hid it," she whispered. "Not in vaults, but in the dust." She placed every document carefully on the table, aligning them in order like a puzzle only she could complete. The silence around her was thick, but not empty. It hummed with purpose. Eleanor switched on an old desk lamp. The yellow light flickered, revealing the layers of time on her face, wrinkles carved not by age but by endurance. She took a deep breath and began her work. One by one, she scanned each document using a small portable scanner she had hidden years ago. She copied files, cross-referenced bank records, matched signatures. Every forged line, every altered number, she documented all of it. She plugged in a silver flash drive and labeled it with a single word: light, because that was what truth deserved. When the last file was copied, she packaged duplicates into 3 envelopes. One she addressed to Henry Lowell, her old lawyer and trusted friend. The second she mailed to herself, an old trick she'd learned for proof of record. The third she encrypted and sent to a list of media contacts. The subject line simple and precise, for when silence isn't protection anymore. Her fingers shook as she sealed the last envelope, but her heart felt strangely light. Revenge wasn't rage, it was revelation. She sat back and looked at the piles of paper now neatly stacked again. Years of deceit transformed into proof. The room no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a courtroom, and she had just built her defense. The following days passed like the calm before a storm. Breakfasts were silent. No music played in the halls. The staff moved nervously, their footsteps hesitant, unsure who held authority now. Richard locked himself in his office, his voice occasionally echoing through the walls in angry, muffled tones. Lucas came home late, avoiding her gaze. Mara pretended politeness but watched Eleanor with narrowed eyes as if waiting for her to slip. And Clara, sweet Clara, sat across from her one morning, eyes red and tired. "Mom," she whispered, "I don't know what to believe anymore." Eleanor stirred her tea slowly. "Believe what you see, not what you're told. But everything feels broken," Clara said. Eleanor looked at her daughter, the reflection of a younger self, trembling on the edge of truth. "Sometimes things must break to let the light in." Clara didn't reply, but her tears said enough. Lucas's guilt began to surface. She caught him once in the hallway, looking at her with something like shame. "Mom," he murmured, "I didn't know." "I know," she said softly. "But you didn't ask either." Mara's tone turned sharper each day. "You've humiliated this family," she spat one evening. "Do you realize what people are saying about us?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "They're saying the truth." "I can live with that," Mara glared. "You think this makes you powerful?" "No," Eleanor said calmly. "It makes me free." Nights grew longer, colder. Eleanor often walked through the halls, hearing echoes of her own footsteps. But the air felt different now, lighter, charged. She knew what she had set in motion. The evidence was no longer hidden. The truth was already spreading beyond the walls. From the conservatory window, she could see the birch tree she and Richard had planted the year they bought the house. Its white trunk gleamed in the moonlight, strong despite the years. She pressed her hand to the cold glass and whispered, "Soon." Behind her, the faint hum of the computer continued. Files uploading, truth moving, quietly, efficiently, unstoppable. They had taken her voice once. Now she was teaching them what silence could do. "They stole my voice for decades. Today I speak, and the world will listen." The courthouse of Port Briar was alive with noise. Reporters swarmed the marble steps, microphones flashing like lightning against the gray morning sky. Neighbors, once content to whisper behind curtains, now stood in clusters, hungry for spectacle. The trial of Eleanor Graves versus Richard Graves was the talk of the entire coast. But when Eleanor arrived, silence followed her. She stepped from the black car, dressed in a simple gray suit. No jewelry, no perfume, only presence. At her side walked Henry Lowell, her lifelong friend and lawyer. His briefcase swung heavily, filled with the truth she had spent years collecting. Cameras clicked, but she didn't flinch. Her expression was calm, almost serene. Richard was already inside, pale, restless, his tie askew. His empire, once immaculate, now smelled of fear. The courtroom filled until every seat was taken. The wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of bodies and curiosity. The judge entered, her voice steady. "This court will now hear the case of Eleanor Graves versus Richard Graves." Charges rolled off the clerk's tongue. Fraud, coercion of an elder, financial abuse, identity forgery. Each word echoed like a bell tolling in Richard's ears. Eleanor sat beside Henry, her hands folded neatly. When Richard's lawyer rose, he smiled thinly. "Your Honor, the defense maintains that Mrs. Graves is a confused woman. Her age and health have affected her memory. Her accusations are emotional, not factual," the crowd murmured. Richard smirked faintly, as if the performance might still save him. Henry stood slowly. "Then let's let the facts speak." One by one, Henry laid the documents before the court. Projector screens displayed contracts with forged signatures, each one carefully authenticated. He showed financial records where Eleanor's inheritance was siphoned into Richard's accounts. Then came the video evidence, Richard's own voice plotting her downfall. Each revelation struck like thunder. Richard's lawyer interrupted. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. My client's memory..." "His memory?" Henry cut in. "Let's test that." He turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Graves, could you tell the court when you first noticed irregularities in your accounts?" Without notes, without hesitation, Eleanor replied, "September 14th, 2015. 2 withdrawals of $12,000 each from my trust account." The bank manager's name was Douglas Keene. Richard claimed it was a clerical error. The courtroom stilled. Henry smiled slightly. "And the loan document with your name?" "January 4th, 2016, she said. "He signed for a real estate partnership under both our names. The ink pressure in my signature differs from mine." It was traced. Her clarity dismantled the defense's argument in seconds. Richard's lawyer tried again. "Mrs. Graves, surely your memory..." is sharper than your conscience, she said coldly. The courtroom rippled with restrained laughter. Henry presented the DNA report next. And finally, he said, the defendant falsified medical documents to conceal his infertility, manipulating both his wife and daughter. The judge's eyes hardened. Mr. Graves, do you wish to respond? Richard stammered. Those are private matters. Irrelevant to. They prove motive, Henry said. He built his entire empire on deception, beginning with his marriage. Eleanor spoke quietly, but her voice carried. He used my silence as his foundation. Tonight I take it back. Under pressure, Richard began to crumble. His confident tone fractured. His words tangled. He contradicted his own statements. When confronted with emails and signatures, he muttered excuses, blaming assistants, bankers, even his children. Lucas and Clara sat in the front row. Lucas's jaw tightened, guilt swimming behind his eyes. Clara clutched her necklace, trembling. Mara sat still, lips pressed thin, realizing that the power she worshipped was an illusion. The final blow came when the judge asked Richard a simple question. Did you, or did you not, transfer the estate deeds using your wife's forged signature? He hesitated. His lawyer whispered urgently, deny it. But something in him broke. Yes, Richard said at last, his voice barely audible. But it wasn't. She was enough, the judge snapped. You have confessed. The crowd erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Richard sank into his chair, the weight of his empire crashing down in his silence. The courtroom held its breath as the judge read the decision. All property transfers are hereby declared invalid. Ownership of Hawthorne Manor and all associated assets will return to Mrs. Eleanor Graves. Furthermore, restitution for damages will be pursued. She paused, her tone softening slightly. Mrs. Graves, this court recognizes your courage and clarity. You did not just defend your rights, you restored your dignity. The gavel struck once. Case closed. For a moment, time froze. Then came the noise, applause, gasps, reporters rushing toward her. Henry smiled quietly beside her, pride hidden beneath restraint. Richard sat motionless, eyes glassy as officers approached. Lucas turned away. Mara's hand slipped from his shoulder. Clara wept quietly, not for her father, but for the years of silence her mother had endured. Outside the courthouse, cameras flared again. The sun was setting over Port Briar Bay, casting gold over Eleanor's silver hair. A reporter pushed forward, microphone raised. Mrs. Graves, how does it feel to have won? Eleanor looked straight into the lens, her voice even. I did not fight, she said. I revealed. The crowd hushed. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder. It's over, he said softly. She looked out toward the horizon where the ocean met the sky. No, she whispered. It's beginning. As the cameras clicked, Eleanor walked down the courthouse steps. Not as the woman they once ignored, but as the woman who taught an entire town that truth may bend, but it never breaks. They thought justice was the end. For me, it was the beginning. Months passed after the trial, and the story of Eleanor Graves spread far beyond Port Briar. Newspapers called her the Widow of Truth. Some saw her as a symbol of resilience. Others whispered about the man who lost everything. But Eleanor ignored them all. She had spent too many years being defined by someone else's words. Now she was building something new, something that belonged entirely to her. Hawthorne Manor, once a place of manipulation and silence, began to transform. The grand iron gates that had once kept her trapped were now open. Construction crews came and went. Dust filled the halls again, but this time, it wasn't the dust of decay, it was the dust of renewal. A new sign hung over the front entrance. The Graves Foundation for Justice and Art. The main hall, once filled with shallow laughter and empty toasts, became a reading room. Rows of shelves now carried books about art, law, and courage. The ballroom where her betrayal had unfolded was converted into a small theater for storytelling and community gatherings. Her old conservatory, once a forgotten archive of secrets, became a gallery. She filled it with paintings created by seniors from local shelters. People who, like her, had been silenced by those they loved most. Each artwork carried a plaque beneath it. Every story deserves light. The foundation quickly grew into a refuge. Seniors who had been financially exploited by their families found legal guidance here. Artists who had lost their voices rediscovered them on its walls. Eleanor watched them come and go each day, her heart swelling not with pride, but peace. When a reporter asked why she named it after the family that hurt her, she replied softly, "Because even a broken name can be rebuilt with truth." Not long after the foundation opened, Lucas and Clara returned. It was a gray morning. Eleanor was standing in the garden when she saw them walking up the gravel path, hesitant, heads lowered. Clara's eyes were red from crying. Lucas's suit was wrinkled, his confidence replaced by guilt. "Mom," Clara whispered, "we came to help. If you'll let us." Eleanor studied them for a long moment. "You're welcome to help," she said. "But understand, helping means seeing." Lucas nodded. "I see now. What I ignored, what I let happen." Behind them stood Mara, hands clasped tightly, unsure if she should speak. "Mrs. Graves," she began, voice trembling, I was cruel. I followed Richard's lead because it was easy. I didn't realize I was helping him destroy you." Eleanor regarded her quietly. "You realized it. You just didn't care until the walls fell." Mara flinched but didn't argue. "You're right," she said softly. "I can't undo it. But I can face it." Eleanor's gaze softened. "Then face it publicly." They exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean?" Lucas asked. "At the foundation's opening," Eleanor said. "You'll all speak. Not for me, for the people who think silence is survival. You'll tell them what silence costs." Clara hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "You still want us there?" "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "Because redemption means being seen." The day of the opening arrived bright and clear. The manor gleamed with new life. Banners fluttered from the balconies. Guests filled the garden, and cameras lined the front lawn. Local news anchors whispered into microphones, ready to capture the next chapter of Port Briar's most famous story. Eleanor stood at the podium in the grand hall, surrounded by portraits she had refused to take down, reminders of history, not shame. Beside her were Lucas, Clara, and Mara. Their faces were pale, their voices unsteady. Lucas spoke first. "For years I believed my father's version of truth. I thought my mother was fragile, forgetful, incapable. I let her fight alone, and for that I will carry regret for the rest of my life." Clara stepped forward next, clutching the microphone. "I loved my father. I defended him. But love isn't loyalty when it protects lies. Mom, I'm sorry for every moment I doubted your strength." Then Mara took a shaky breath. "I thought power came from money, image, control. I see now it comes from honesty. Mrs. Graves, I don't expect forgiveness. But thank you for letting me stand here and admit what I was." Silence followed. For a moment, only the soft hum of the wind filled the room. Then the audience, neighbors, journalists, survivors, rose to their feet in quiet applause. The sound was not loud. It was reverent. Eleanor stepped forward, eyes glistening with tears she didn't hide. "I am not angry," she said. "I am finally seen." She looked out at the sea of faces, each one reflecting her story in some way. The Graves Foundation isn't about revenge. It's about return, the return of truth, of art, of voice. And if you've ever been silenced, know that silence is not your ending. It's your beginning. As the crowd cheered, Clara took her mother's hand. Lucas bowed his head, finally at peace. Mara wept quietly, not from guilt, but relief. Outside, the birch tree swayed in the breeze, the same tree Eleanor had once planted with Richard decades ago. Its branches stretched toward the sun, strong, unbroken. Eleanor turned to the audience one last time and smiled. "They called me invisible. Now I live in every story that finds its voice here." The applause swelled. The cameras flashed, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor Graves wasn't surviving. She was living. "They thought I would cling to what I built. But freedom isn't in keeping, it's in letting go." The ceremony had ended. The applause faded into soft conversation, and the crowd slowly drifted away from the garden. Inside, laughter echoed through the halls of the newly reborn Hawthorne Manor, the same place that had once been a house of secrets. Now it pulsed with life, truth, and forgiveness. Eleanor stood alone outside beneath the open sky. The sun had dipped low, painting the clouds in hues of gold and lavender. The wind carried the scent of salt from Port Briar Bay. Before her stood the old birch tree, its bark pale and flaking, its branches strong against the evening light. She stepped closer, her hand brushing over the trunk. "You remember, don't you? she whispered. The birch had been planted the year she and Richard bought the estate. Back when love was still simple, when she believed promises could last forever. Its roots had grown deep, surviving storms, droughts, and neglect. Much like her. For a long moment, she simply stood there, palm pressed to its bark, feeling its quiet strength. The memories came, her young laughter as she dug the soil, Richard's hand guiding hers, Clara playing with the watering can, Lucas running barefoot through the grass. Moments of warmth before betrayal, before silence. You saw it all, she murmured. The rise, the fall, and the return. The wind rustled the branches in reply, leaves shimmering like silver coins in the fading light. The last guests were leaving through the gates when Eleanor turned toward the house one final time. Through the windows, she could see Lucas speaking to visitors, Clara hugging children from the art classes, Mara helping an elderly couple find their way to the reading room. The manor was full again, not of greed, but of purpose. Eleanor smiled faintly. Her work was done. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her silver locket, the one she had once sold to save Richard's company, the one she had later bought back quietly after the trial. It glimmered softly in her palm. Inside was a photo of her younger self, eyes full of hope. She closed it gently and held it tight. Then she turned away from the house. Her children watched from inside as she passed through the open gates. None of them called out. They understood. This wasn't abandonment. It was release. Eleanor walked slowly down the gravel path, her voice a whisper carried by the sea breeze. I am not leaving in anger. I am leaving in peace. The sound of her footsteps faded into the hush of the evening. Behind her, the manor glowed with golden light, its windows alive with laughter and art. Ahead of her stretched the quiet coastal road of Port Briar. As dusk settled, Eleanor walked along the curve of the bay. The ocean mirrored the dying sun, red and silver against the horizon. Her hair fluttered in the wind, her figure small but unbowed, her voice drifted through the still air, calm and steady. Her final narration. I needed no revenge. I only needed remembrance. Because silence never meant weakness. It meant waiting. She reached the edge of the cliff overlooking Port Briar, where the waves crashed softly against the rocks below. For a moment, she closed her eyes, feeling the rhythm of the sea, the same rhythm that had always called her back to herself. Behind her, the manor stood illuminated like a lantern of truth. Within its walls, people spoke, painted, healed. Laughter replaced lies. Hope replaced fear. And for the first time in decades, Eleanor Graves was no longer haunted by her home. She was part of its legacy. She turned down the road once more, the silver locket swinging lightly in her hand. The night sky unfolded above her, vast and clear. Her final words, carried as a whisper to the viewer, closed her story. If Eleanor's story moved you, share it. Because every forgotten voice deserves a second chance to be heard. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that silence isn't surrender. It's strength waiting for the right moment to speak. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories of resilience, truth, and second chances, because somewhere out there, another Eleanor is still waiting to be heard. Even silence carries power when truth finally speaks.